The now ex-Labour MP, Thangam Debonair, has accused the Green Party of misleading voters on Labour's stance on Gaza. In an interview with Channel 4, Debonair blamed the loss of her Bristol seat to Green Party leader Carla Denyer on Labour's failure to counter what she saw as a misrepresentation of her ceasefire voting record. Here is a clip from the interview.
What do you think it was that cost you your seat? Was it that sort of the leadership was too prosaic? Was it the ditching of the Green Investment Pledge, because obviously you lost to the Greens? Or was it the failure to come up with a more robust stance towards Israel?
Well, it was all of those. And it was the fact that the Green Party knew how to capitalise on them. I think the party does need to look at the playbook, not just of the Greens, but of Reform and the Independents, because they all use the same playbook. They didn't always use the same script, although sometimes it was overlapping. But it's a danger if you get in the habit as a campaigning political party of saying things that are actually not true, but sound good. I actually did vote for a ceasefire, not once, but twice. And our motion, our amendment to the motion in February, that got through unanimously for all sorts of reasons, but it did. One of them being we knew how to handle parliaments. Now, that wasn't what the Green Party sent out. And it was difficult because I kind of knew from November that I was going to lose the seat, because I thought this is what they'll use. And if my party doesn't communicate what we've done, what we're saying, then obviously voters don't know it. They don't follow every tiny twist and turn of politics. They're not all on Twitter. And by the time people have got a belief in their heads and you're on the doorstep saying, no, I voted for it twice, they don't believe you anymore.
So to be blunt, your opponents lied and your party failed to tackle the lies. Is that the playbook you were talking about?
It's more subtle. On the leaflets that they put out, they didn't say that I'd voted against the ceasefire, but people interpreted that from them saying she failed to vote for a ceasefire motion. True, I failed to vote for one because it didn't mention the hostages.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. First of all, there's the standard pound shop Orwellian analysis there of collapsing Reform and the Greens as two opportunistic campaigning parties that use the same playbook, i.e. lying, to get ahead. I don't think you can really compare the ideological backbone of the Green Party and Reform. They are literally on opposite ends of the spectrum. In this case, she's arguing that the Greens successfully and cynically exploited people's grief regarding Gaza to win their seat. But she then goes on to confirm that nothing the Greens said about her position is actually untrue. She did fail to vote for a ceasefire, and I remember that vote because I was outside Parliament when it happened. And it was a key vote put forward by the SNP in November, which Labour whipped its MPs into voting against or abstaining because it was an SNP vote. And, Labour voting for a ceasefire at that moment, it wouldn't have ended the war, sure. But Britain is a key ally and enabler of Israel, and had a ceasefire vote passed, or at least gotten the support of one of the two main parties in this country at that very early stage. This was in November, so it was not long after the war on Gaza started. If that had passed, it would have been a significant symbolic gesture on the international stage that could have potentially had broader knock-on effects. And that's why it was so important that Labour voted for it, or at least that Starmer didn't implement a whip punishing MPs for voting for that ceasefire. And to ordinary people on the ground, it really felt like Labour was prioritising petty Westminster politics over the opportunity to officially condemn atrocities that we were watching in graphic detail on our phones, because many people felt that the reason that Labour took this stance wasn't because of any sincere concern with the wording, but simply because it was an SNP motion. And the SNP, the Labour wants to, defang the SNP in Scotland. That was key to their electoral strategy. And it's not to mention that if we're actually looking at Thangam Debonair specifically, some Labour MPs actually did take principled stances. In November, when that vote came up, 8 frontbenchers, including Jess Phillips, resigned from Starmer's cabinet in order to vote for a ceasefire in Gaza. And unlike Debonair, Jess Phillips was actually able to hold on to her seat despite a significant challenge from Workers' Party candidate Jodie McIntyre. And maybe that's because when Phillips was concretely supporting a ceasefire, Debonair was giving mealy-mouthed defences of the Labour Party's position, such as this one.
Why not call for a ceasefire?
Well, what we want is going beyond that, which is long-term peace in the region. We want a safe and secure Palestine and Israel living side by side. Now, in order to get there, we will need a cessation of violence in order to get aid in and to get talks to start one day. But we also need the hostages to be released, and we need the bombardment to stop so that we can get that aid in. Now, that's going to be difficult. Israel does have a right to self-defense, but the Palestinian people also have rights, and they are being it's so badly damaged. There's the death and destruction that we're seeing distressingly on our TV screens each night. I cannot begin to imagine what that's like.
It's also worth mentioning here that many voters were expressing a broader anger and a legitimate anger with the approach of Starmer's Labour to Palestine. For many, Starmer seeming to defend Israel's right to cut off water and power to Gaza was a turning point that simply couldn't be forgiven. Not to mention that instead of pressuring the government to take more concrete action against Israeli war crimes, Starmer seemed to reserve most of his energy for disciplining MPs like Kate Ossamore, who were suspended for calling Israel's assault on Gaza a genocide. And, Starmer's also parachuting Israeli lobbyists into safe Labour seats. So what Debonair misses here is that the strong feeling that the electorate had about Labour's failure to not only take concrete action on Gaza, but to punish those who tried to push the needle on this issue. That was not because they were easily manipulated by a cynical Green Party campaign. That was actually deep political literacy and conviction on behalf of the electorate. That's something that I think Debonair could stand to learn from some of her, people who were at one point voting for her and chose not to vote for her in the most recent election. Debonair also misses that support for the Greens in Bristol was already growing before the war on Gaza even began. So whilst Debonair's vote share in the 2019 election was strong, that was during Corbyn's left-wing leadership. Once Corbyn was replaced by centrist Starmer, support for Labour in the local council elections plummeted in favour of the Greens, who gained 10 seats. So support for Labour in Bristol was already waning in favour of the Greens, and Gaza was simply the final nail in the coffin. So, Mike, there's a lot to discuss here, and I think that interview tells us a lot about the way that the Labour Party is not really taking responsibility for the voters that they lost in this election. Debonair's main point here is that there is actually no problem with the party's position on Gaza. It was just a matter of communication. Do you think this was just a communication issue, or was there something specific and concrete about the Labour Party's approach to Gaza that caused them to lose votes to independent pro-Palestine MPs and to Green Party candidates as well?
Well, I think there are two things happening. I think Bristol's an interesting one because I think the Greens had a rise on Bristol since 2019. Now, we know that Carla came, not close to Tangham in that election, but it was close enough that we could be like, okay, we can have a look at this seat for next time and kind of build some momentum. Now, what happened in the local elections in May is that the Greens won every single ward in the Bristol Central constituency, right? And they were one seat short, I think, of a majority in the council. So the Greens have been building momentum for a number of years in Bristol Central. What also happened is we know that Starmer, over the past 4 or 5 years, has shifted Labour to the right. Now, Bristol, for those who've been to Bristol, will know that Bristol is a city that generally leans to the left. So all of those things kind of amalgamated and came together, and the Greens just began to build momentum. Another thing that was key and an important thing to note in Bristol Central is the constituency boundary changes, which I think some people said it halved Debonair's kind of vote share because it kind of favoured the Greens in some ways. So all those things matter. But what's really, really important as well, and I think ultimately Palestine was the kind of tipping point, was the growing momentum was really there, and Gaza was like the kind of like final nail in the coffin in my view. And what happens is people seem to view this kind of war in Gaza as an ethnic issue, as a Muslim issue. And in some ways it might be, but this was also viewed by many voters, including those in Bristol, as a moral issue. And what Labour have done since October the 7th is be committed dogmatically committed to being on the wrong side of history. Whether it's Starmer's infamous interview of, Israel has the right to defend itself and, Israel has the right to cut off electricity and water, or just a general approach, Labour's failure to call out the genocidal language used by its senior Israeli politicians, Labour's failure to speak compassionately about Palestinians and their plight, and to speak about the plight and use emphatic language about the plight of Palestinians in Gaza. Labour were on the wrong side of the story. And I think in another kind of segment of that interview, Debonair speaks about Labour not having a strong enough narrative on the war in Gaza. Labour's narrative was pretty damn strong. Labour's narrative was, Israel, keep doing what you're doing. We support your right to defend yourself. Now, as we know, hundreds of thousands of people have died in Gaza. Palestinians have been kind of indiscriminately targeted by the Israeli state. And Labour kind of stood back and said, yeah, carry on, guys. So that's why voters punished them, because it wasn't just viewed as kind of like Muslim issue. If a government or if a party cannot defend the plight of civilians, the indiscriminate plight of civilians, what does that say about where they could take the country moving forward? What does that say about their foreign policy approach moving forward? And that's where voters were. Voters viewed this issue as a moral issue. And voters across the country, whether it's the independents who won, whether it's the Green seats that won as well, voters punished Labour's stance on that issue. And it's because it was seen as a really important moral issue. And I think that's the lens through which people need to view this issue. This was an issue that says to me, if Labour aren't going to stand for the most vulnerable in society or the most vulnerable around the world, what does that say about a general governing philosophy? And for loads of voters that said, I'm not so sure they're going to care about the most marginalised across the world or in Britain. And that's why they were punished. So yes, their narrative was clear. They were on the wrong side of history. And if you want to win over those voters, they need to have the humility to understand that it wasn't about communicating your position clearer. It was that your communication was clear enough. We all got the point and we didn't like it. And if Labour continue to be on the wrong side of history on this issue, they will be punished, whether it's at by-elections in a couple of years to come, whenever the by-elections happen, whether it's at local elections, this stance will be punished.
I don't think that Labour understood that for so many people in this country, what is happening in Gaza is like one of the great moral atrocities of modern history. And I think there's a strong sense that that is how future generations are going to look back in this moment and, in those terms. And with the gravity of that, it feels like, well, of course, I'm not going to vote for a party that seems to be complicit in that continuing. And I also just think that this idea of like, oh, how could the Green Party be so cynical as to lie about me? First of all, by her own admission, they didn't actually lie. Like, they did say what her position was. Second of all, a lot of people, could see that the Labour Party were not stepping up to this moment. But also, like, Thangam Debonair is from the right of the party. The right and the centre of the Labour Party have no problem lying and smearing parts of the party that they don't disagree with. They just came off from calling Muslim voters who were leaving the party because of the position on Gaza, shaking off the fleas. Like, these are not people who are like above smearing and, misrepresenting factions that they don't agree with and factions that they don't like. And so I think it's a really bad, if I was Thangam Debonair, I would have just called it. I think it's a really bad look after you've lost in not just a specific seat like that, but, if we look at broadly across the country, I think it's like 4 pro-Palestine independent MPs plus 4 MPs from the Green Party won seats in this election. Reform, which are considered to be, the insurgent party in the country, the country whose voters we all have to take really, really seriously, who, can't be written off at all, who are the main characters, as it were, of this election, they won 5 seats. So really the pro-Palestine vote was actually stronger in many ways than the Reform vote. And I think it's a really bad look for someone like Thangam Debonair to go on TV and basically say they were all gullible and tricked by a manipulative Green Party campaign. That's not, people voted with quite a lot of moral clarity. And I don't think that the Labour Party could really understand how motivating that kind of moral clarity on this specific issue was going to be.